I want to talk to you about a story that many people think they already understand. They heard the headline, they saw a clip on social media, maybe they caught a debate moment or a news segment, and they walked away thinking this was just another skirmish in the endless political back and forth between the United States and Canada. But the real story, the economic story, is not the one most people saw. What happened here wasn't just a diplomatic disagreement or a personality clash. It was a moment that revealed something deeper about how economic power works across borders, who actually pays the price for political decisions, and why millions of Americans end up footing the bill without even realizing it. You might have had that reaction yourself, wondering how a decision by Canada to reject a proposal coming out of the Trump orbit could somehow cost ordinary Americans real money. And that is exactly the reaction I want to unpack, because the truth is both simpler and more troubling than the headline suggested. Here is what officially happened in brief terms. Canadian leadership was presented with pressure, both publicly and behind the scenes, to sign on to a series of economic and trade-related commitments that aligned with the agenda pushed by Donald Trump and his political allies. Some of these pushes were framed as national security measures, others as protection for domestic industries, and others as adjustments to cross-border energy and manufacturing relationships. Canada looked at these proposals, evaluated what they meant for its own economy, and in several cases responded with a straightforward message: no thanks. They declined to adopt the measures, declined to shift their policies, declined to accept the economic framing that U.S. negotiators were using, and publicly, that sounded like a diplomatic disagreement. But economically, this set off a chain reaction that very few Americans ever heard about and even fewer understood. Let me pause here, because when we talk about trade agreements, cross-border supply chains, or bilateral economic policies, it's easy to lose people in the jargon. But you don't need any special training to understand what's going on. When two deeply integrated economies like the US and Canada disagree on the rules of the game, somebody absorbs the cost. And most of the time, it's not the politicians, it's not the executives at the big firms, and it's certainly not the lobbyists drafting briefings. It's you. It's workers whose jobs depend on stable contracts and predictable supply chains. It's small businesses that rely on parts or materials crossing the border. It's farmers dealing with retaliatory tariffs or shipping delays. It's entire communities in the northern states that are woven into continental markets. These are the people who pay when political theater replaces economic planning. Before we get into the mechanics of how Americans lost millions because of this refusal, let's take a step back and see how we got here. The North American economy was built over decades, not by accident, but through decisions that tied industries together. Auto manufacturing stretches across Michigan, Ontario, and Ohio as if they were one region. Energy flows through pipelines and grids that don't care what the border looks like on a map. Agricultural markets depend on timing, pricing, and customs systems working smoothly. When a political figure comes along and says they can tear this up, renegotiate it from scratch, or reshape it in a matter of months based on campaign rhetoric, that's not bold leadership. That's destabilizing something millions of people quietly depend on every day. And when Canada refuses to play along with that approach, they're not just defying a politician. They're signaling that they won't put their economy at risk to accommodate the shifting winds of U.S. politics. Some of you might be thinking, but don't countries push back on each other all the time? Isn't this just how geopolitics works? And yes, countries disagree, they protect their interests, they negotiate, but you and I live inside systems where the consequences of those disagreements don't fall evenly. When a billionaire loses part of a cross-border investment because a trade policy changes, that's a line item on a spreadsheet. When a working-class family loses a job because the plant depends on Canadian steel or American machinery, that's a lost income, a medical bill they suddenly can't cover, a mortgage payment that becomes a threat. And the people making these decisions know that. They know who carries the real burden, yet they continue to treat these international relationships as if they were personal rivalries rather than complex economic ecosystems. What Canada said no to, once you strip away the political branding, was the idea that it should absorb instability generated for reasons that had little to do with economic logic and everything to do with domestic U.S. politics. That refusal didn't just irritate the Trump circle. It forced American firms, workers, and consumers to pay the costs of uncertainty. Contracts were delayed, investment plans were paused, prices shifted, markets reacted. And every time one of those things happens, money moves, usually away from ordinary Americans and toward whoever is best positioned to benefit from volatility. You don't need to follow every detail to understand that uncertainty is a tax, and it's a tax paid overwhelmingly by people with the least cushion to absorb it. Now, to really understand how this unfolded, you have to look at the structural background that made the United States so vulnerable to this kind of disruption in the first place. For decades, policymakers told the American public that globalization was a win-win arrangement. They said open borders for capital, deeper integration of supply chains, and a continental economic model would mean jobs, competitive industries, and cheaper goods. What they rarely acknowledged was that the entire structure relied on stability, predictability, and trust between governments. If even one of those pillars cracks, the whole system begins to wobble. So when the Trump approach inserted unpredictability into the trade relationship with Canada, it didn't land on neutral ground. It landed on an economy already stretched thin by decades of offshoring, weakened unions, privatized essential services, and households living one emergency away from crisis. You can see how a small tremor at the top quickly becomes an earthquake at the bottom. Think about what this looks like for you in practical terms. Maybe you work in an industry where parts cross the border more than once before a final product is finished. Maybe you rely on consumer goods whose prices hinge on exchange rates and tariffs. Maybe your employer adjusts schedules, reduces hours, or freezes hiring when cross-border shipping gets delayed. These ripple effects aren't abstract. They show up in your paycheck, your bills, and the stability of your local economy. So when Canada said no to a set of proposals that lacked clarity or long-term planning, they weren't rejecting cooperation. They were rejecting chaos. And the price for that chaos didn't fall evenly. You can guess who ended up absorbing it. The mechanisms behind this are worth breaking down, because they show how something that looks like a political disagreement can become an economic drain on millions of ordinary people. When a government signals that trade rules may shift abruptly, businesses that rely on those rules begin to hedge their risks. They delay expansion. They cut back on new hiring. They shift money into less productive but safer investments. Every one of those decisions has a cost. If you run a small business, uncertainty feels like an expense. If you work for a large corporation, uncertainty feels like restructuring or cost cutting. And if you're a consumer, uncertainty feels like higher prices justified by vague explanations about supply chain pressures. These are not accidental outcomes. They are the predictable results of injecting instability into a system built on the expectation of steady cooperation. Here is where the divergence between political messaging and economic reality becomes especially sharp. The narrative told to the American public was that this tough approach would force Canada to the table, securing better deals for U.S. workers. But international partners are not employees waiting for instructions. Canada responded not with compliance, but with caution, reinforcing long-term partnerships elsewhere and signaling that it would not jeopardize its economic stability to accommodate a shifting set of demands. And when a country the size of Canada repositions even slightly, the effects cascade through North American supply chains. Manufacturers that depend on just-in-time logistics suddenly face higher costs. Energy markets adjust. Agricultural exports encounter new barriers. And all of these changes, no matter how small individually, accumulate into millions of dollars lost by American producers, consumers, and workers. Some viewers might assume these losses only impacted big corporations, and maybe that feels distant from your daily life. But corporations don't simply absorb the losses. They pass them downward. They pass them to workers through wage stagnation or job insecurity. They pass them to consumers through price increases and hidden fees. They pass them to small suppliers by renegotiating contracts under less favorable terms. They pass them to communities when they delay or cancel investments that would have supported local tax bases. What begins as a diplomatic rejection becomes a financial burden you end up carrying in ways you rarely get to see explained on the evening news. The deeper we look, the clearer it becomes that the problem is not just the decision Canada made, but the economic model that allows millions of Americans to bear the cost of political theatrics they did not ask for and cannot control. This is not about liking or disliking a particular political figure. It's about the structural reality that when unstable policy becomes a governing strategy, ordinary people pay the price, and they pay it quietly through lost wages, higher bills, and shrinking economic security. To see how this situation actually worked on the ground, imagine the position of a manufacturer in the Midwest that relies on components arriving from Ontario. On a normal day, that factory expects shipments to arrive on schedule, production lines to run smoothly, and workers to get the hours they were promised. But when political uncertainty clouds the border, every part of that chain tightens. Shipping companies start adding risk premiums. Customs officers face shifting guidance. Managers redraw their schedules because they cannot guarantee delivery times. Suddenly, a shipment that once moved with ease becomes a logistical gamble, and that gamble has a cost. It might mean fewer shifts for workers, slower overtime, or postponed hiring. The public rarely hears about these micro delays, but when thousands of them happen at once, the economic impact becomes massive. This is where incentives play a central role. Large corporations, unlike ordinary workers, have tools to protect themselves when political instability creeps into their operations. They can diversify supply chains, redirect investments, or lobby quietly for carve-outs that shield them from the worst outcomes. In other words, they can buffer themselves. You cannot. Most people working paycheck to paycheck cannot diversify their income sources because of a diplomatic standoff. You cannot insulate your grocery bill from tariff-driven price increases. You cannot hedge your employment prospects against sudden shifts in trade rules. So the very people with the least control over these decisions face the greatest exposure to the risks created by them. And while Canada's refusal was framed as an act of defiance toward the Trump camp, what it truly exposed was a deeper asymmetry in the U.S. economy itself. When a smaller country can say no to the world's largest economy and the economic shock ripples downward onto millions of American households, that tells us something is structurally off. It tells us that the U.S. has allowed its economic foundations to become so dependent on fragile political alignments that even a modest diplomatic disagreement can produce real losses for ordinary people. And think about what that means for you. It means that your economic security depends not on stable planning, but on the mood, strategy, or electoral calculations of political actors who might not even consider the long-term consequences for workers and families. We also need to talk about the key actors who shape this outcome, because decisions like these do not emerge from thin air. The Trump administration and later the political influence associated with the Trump movement embraced a strategy built on unilateral pressure. The logic was that hardline demands would extract favorable concessions from countries like Canada. But that strategy overlooked something essential. Canada is not just a trading partner. It is structurally intertwined with the U.S. economy. Applying pressure to an integrated partner is not like negotiating a standalone contract. It is like tugging at one end of a rope that is tied to your own waist. You feel the pull too, and American consumers felt it. American farmers felt it. American manufacturers felt it. Meanwhile, many of the political strategists pushing this approach did not personally experience the fallout that unfolded across the country. Canada's leaders, for their part, had clear domestic incentives to maintain stability. Their economy depends heavily on reliable cross-border flows, and their political system, whatever its flaws, tends to impose a higher expectation of policy consistency than what Americans have become accustomed to in recent years. So when asked to accept proposals that shifted quickly, lacked long-term clarity, or threatened to undermine predictable market conditions, Canada did what any risk-averse economy does. It protected itself. It refused. And in doing so, it forced the United States to confront the consequences of its own strategy. You might wonder why other leaders or institutions in the U.S. didn't step in sooner to minimize the damage. The answer lies in the distribution of power within the American political economy. Corporate lobbies benefited from parts of the instability because it allowed them to negotiate for exemptions and protections unavailable to smaller players. Politicians benefited because framing the conflict as a patriotic confrontation played well with sections of the electorate. Media outlets benefited because conflict attracts attention. And in that environment, the people who lost, workers, families, and small businesses, did not have the political leverage to demand stability or long-term planning. The system rewarded the turbulence rather than containing it. As the uncertainty dragged on, the consequences compounded. Firms scaled back operations, prices inched upward, government agencies had to allocate additional resources to navigate cross-border tensions. But none of this was presented to the public as a single, coherent story. Instead, Americans experienced it piecemeal, a more expensive grocery item here, a delayed shipment there, a cutback in hours at work, a canceled expansion project in their community. It was felt as fragments rather than as a systemic pattern, and that fragmentation made it easier for political figures to deny responsibility. After all, it is easy to dismiss a single inconvenience. It is harder to recognize that hundreds of thousands of these small inconveniences were actually symptoms of a much larger structural problem. This is why understanding the mechanics matters. Canada's refusal did not create the losses Americans experienced.